So by now we learned a lot about the important basics of Redux and how we use it. Now the more complex our projects become, the more complex it can get to use Redux correctly. Now the good thing is that in this course you will of course see many examples, also bigger projects than this one, but another good news is that there is a slightly easier way of using Redux as well. Now, I wanted to show you the core foundation first so that you understand how it works. But now I want to dive into an approach that's a bit easier to set up and maintain. Before we do that though, let's identify a couple of potential problems we could be facing here if our application would continue to grow. So if we manage more and more state with Redux. One potential issue can be our action types, these identifiers. I mentioned it before. You of course have to avoid typos. If you dispatch an action, you have to make sure that you don't mistype the identifier here, otherwise it of course won't be handled by the reducer or won't be handled correctly. Now that's not a problem in a small app like this, but in bigger applications, with a lot of developers working on the app and with a lot of different actions, it's super easy to imagine that you could mess up one of these identifiers. You could even have clashing identifiers there, so clashing identifier names. So therefore, having some way of defining those identifiers once and then reusing them would be nice. And that is something we can do with JavaScript and something I will come back to in a second. Another potential problem is the amount of data which we manage here. The more data we have, the more different pieces of state we have, the bigger our state objects get. And that means that we need to copy a lot of state. When we update the counter, we still need to copy and keep all the other state properties. And it also means that this reducer function gets longer and longer. And all of a sudden, we might have an unmaintainably big Redux file. And you might recall that I brought this up as one potential disadvantage of React context if we put everything into one context provider file. Now, we can end up with the same problem with Redux, but thankfully there are solutions for that with Redux. Another potential problem we could be facing is the state immutability, which we have to respect. I talked about it in the last lecture. We have to ensure that we always return a brand new state snapshot and that we don't accidentally change the existing state anywhere. And especially if you have more complex data with nested objects and arrays, it's easy to mess this up and accidentally change some nested data, even though you didn't want to. So it would be great if we would have some help with that as well. And if we could ensure that we don't accidentally manipulate nested data or anything like that. Now, for all those problems, there are solutions we could implement on our own. For example, for ensuring that we have unique identifiers and we don't mistype, we could create constants, let's say a constant named increment, which stores this identifier, and we then export this constant, and we check that constant's value here, and we then import and use that constant in the counter component, so that here we use the type increment and we just import increment. So we import increment from going up store index. That is something we could do to fix this issue. And these are approaches which we typically used in the past with Redux. There also are solutions for splitting your reducer into multiple smaller reducers so that you don't get this large, super big file. And there also are solutions and third-party packages which allow you to automatically copy state and ensure that you don't accidentally edit it. But we actually don't need to dive into those various solutions anymore. Instead, there is another library called Redux Toolkit. And you can just Google for Redux Toolkit to find its official page. It's actually developed by the same person or the same team as React Redux and Redux itself. And Redux Toolkit simply is an extra package which makes working with Redux more convenient and easier. You don't have to use it. Unlike Redux and React Redux, which we installed before, you don't have to install and use Redux Toolkit. But if you use it, certain things will get easier. And therefore, in the next lecture, we're going to get started with Redux Toolkit.